This is the Hidden Killers podcast with Tony Brueski.
A lot of us brought up in churches and religious organizations, and we're always kind of taught, no, it's a good, safe place. It's a nice place. And for many of us, it was. For many others, though, it is not. And a place that some look back on with a lot of sadness and a lot of trauma. As an adult, you can look at some of these places, and we're also told, respect it. It's a religious organization. That's their beliefs. Just leave them alone. What I find scary about that is the fact that we have free thinking, we have free will. And when we see things going on that look to be questionable or possibly traumatic to people, the only thing that's stopping anyone looking into some of those cases more is the word religion and a group that this is how they do things and we all should back off. But that doesn't necessarily seem to be the best idea when people are suffering and it's right in front of us. And the only thing that's stopping it is religion. Dr. Laura Anderson is joining us to discuss just that, a licensed psychotherapist, trauma resolution coach, and religious trauma consultant. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation because it's something that I have been noticing so much in so many of the cases that we follow. A lot of these things stem back to some sort of extreme religious belief, and that is used as justification for whatever sort of ill behavior one may be playing out. Sometimes they're aware. Sometimes I think it's the indoctrination that people don't even realize how dark things can get. And there's so much to talk about here, Laura. So I want to start by getting your story. How did you go into this area? Why did you feel passionate about this to try and help people who are suffering from religious trauma?
Yeah, well, a little bit of it is kind of what you were saying there. Religion has colloquially and culturally been looked at as a very pro-social factor. I came from a high control religion. My dad was a director at a fundamentalist church camp where I lived year round. I experienced a lot of different things as an adult. I live in the Bible Belt in the South, right in the buckle of the Bible Belt, and where religion is just a part of everyday life. They ask you, what's your name and what church do you go to? Mm-hmm. That's how people introduce themselves. And as somebody who had experienced a lot of abuse and adverse religious experiences myself and had done a lot of trauma healing work around that, I started to notice it just in my clients in their everyday interactions where they would say, this thing happened to me. It wasn't necessarily like clergy sexual abuse, which is what we traditionally think of when we think of religious trauma, but their bodies physiologically, they're presenting very similarly to other victims of trauma. And so I started putting some of these pieces together and starting to recognize that these institutions that have traditionally been considered safe and supportive and the place you go to for identity and kind of a higher purpose other than yourself were actually the places where so much harm was actually happening. And so that was what really inspired my own work to begin to branch out with clients and kind of be known as somebody who works with this population.
Sure. I mean, and that's you're exactly right. Those places to many were safe. And to many, they still are. I want to be careful to say that on this. This is not a let's bash religion episode. This is more so let's be more aware of what we are accepting and saying as safe and okay before we just say it's safe and okay because someone's holding a cross. That doesn't always necessarily mean the best of intentions there. It can also be a way that people use to manipulate and to get to people or to groom them. And you're right. You're exactly right in that earlier point that it's not always some sort of sexual deviancy that's going on. Obviously, there's far too much of that, and we see that in so many cases, but sometimes it goes beyond that. In many cases, I think it goes beyond that, where it's a grooming type of behavior to get people to act in a certain way for a certain purpose. And it's easy to say, well, it's what God wants you to do. It's also easy to influence young people or children or people who maybe don't know a whole lot about God or religion, who are new to it, and they're finding it to be a safe place to say, well, this is what this is. But in reality, some of those directives, some of that grooming behavior is the furthest thing from biblical teaching.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think anytime we put God as kind of like an umbrella over this is why you must do X, Y, and Z, or this is why you must believe this thing, we are invoking another dynamic of power and control where we've got certain people or a person at the top saying, here's how you must live. And oh, by the way, this is the right, godly, biblical way according to the holy text.
Mhm.
And that puts eternal consequence on it. It puts additional consequence. If I don't follow this, perhaps I'll be disconnected from the community. My ability to access family and friends, or maybe make a living for those people who are full-time, like being paid by churches. There's a lot of, in these communities of high control religion, there's a lot of different like identity factors that are all wrapped up in that particular faith or that particular religion or belief system. And so to simply get out of it or to stop believing it is fairly impossible because you don't know who you are outside of that. And we see that all the time. I know some of the cases that you talk about, like there's those religious components, and some of the reasons that they do the things that they do is because that's what God said, or because it's a part of a belief system that they uphold, or they believe that they are doing the right thing according to their religion. And so anytime that we put God in the mix of this is why we do what we do, it adds a lot of justification for really dangerous behaviors and systems of belief and thinking and values that aren't. You can't just turn it off. You can't just say, no, thank you. You have to believe it.
And there are so many paths we could go down here and talk about far longer than we have. Maybe we'll do another one of these down the road. But just tell me from your experience, what are some of the main things that you see when people come to you who have a religious trauma that they are working through? Maybe they're not even aware that they have it. What are some of the most common that you deal with in your practice that, maybe these are things people didn't talk about 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah. So one of the statements that I make a lot on social media, in my book, in other podcasts, is that religious trauma is trauma. And the reason I say that is because I view the word religious in religious trauma as a bit of an adjective that helps us understand the context under which maybe the abuse or trauma resulted from. And so that's important because when we're looking for signs, okay, is this religious trauma? Was I traumatized by this group or this system or this person? We actually have a great deal of research available to us that shows here's kind of how traumatized individuals might present. And so I really view religious trauma under the umbrella of complex trauma. We have PTSD, which is kind of our single incident traumas. It's our car accidents. It's the experiences in war, kind of some of the things that we traditionally consider trauma. And then we have what we consider complex trauma. And these are going to be maybe not overt, like single incidences, but it's going to be kind of this persistent, consistent threats of overwhelm that is inescapable, that happens over a long period of time. So when you think about being in a high control religion, we're talking about people that maybe don't have the ability to escape. You think about a child who is born into this, they don't get to fight back. They don't get to run away. They have nowhere to go. And so they're kind of in this space of constant activation where they are feeling endangered a lot of the time. So when we're coming out of that, when the clients are landing in my office or the offices of my colleagues, we're seeing a lot of things like hypervigilance, social phobias, autoimmune disorders, gastrointestinal disorders, relational difficulties, behavioral health issues, mental health issues such as, OCD, anxiety, depression, all sorts of different symptoms that are resulting from these systems. Sometimes it's the way they coped with a high control system, and other times, in a lot of cases, the way that trauma works is that our body kind of is in survival mode. And when we finally are able to get out of survival mode, we start to see various symptoms arise after the fact, after our body knows, okay, we're safe. And so that can then also look like feeling very hypervigilant, very triggered. Perhaps I live in the South where they play, religious music in every store. And so you're walking down the aisle of Target and all of a sudden you hear a religious song and it's like, I've got to get out of here. Or I start sweating, my heart starts beating faster. I feel like, I want to crawl out of my skin. Those are what we would call trauma responses, where our body is feeling like we are back in this dangerous spot. So we also look for some of those, what we might consider overinflated responses to maybe some normal kind of everyday things that happen. But if people are going, hey, do I have this? Is this something that might resonate with what my experience has been? I always encourage people, I don't love Google, but it works for this, to Google complex PTSD or complex trauma and look at some of the symptoms and see, how does my kind of present day experience fit into those symptoms? Would that be, something that I identify with? And that can oftentimes be a really good starting place to say, maybe the things that I experienced resulted in trauma and didn't go away simply because I stopped believing X, Y, or Z, or because I left this building and decided to not go back.
Want to listen ad-free? Want advanced access to all of our interviews before anyone else?
Become a True Crime Today Premium Plus subscriber on Apple Podcasts.
You get every episode commercial-free,
so you can binge on true crime
until you can binge no more.
Search True Crime Today Premium Plus on Apple Podcasts now, or go to our podcast page and sign up now.
More of the Hidden Killers podcast next.